Hello, everybody. We will wait until time for class to start, and then I will go ahead and get the quiz going for y'all. All right, it is 1. I don't want to make anybody who's here wait to get things going. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly. All right, so let me show you how you find this. I'll put it in student view so I will see what you typically see. All right, so if you go down our Blackboard page, you'll find a thing that says exams/quizzes. And there you will find quiz 2. So what you'll find when you do this is it's the exact same format as before, same points, all that good stuff. But you just have multiple choice. And then your matching are down at the bottom. So it's gonna freak out on me because nope, it didn't. That's nice. So I'm gonna go ahead. I'm gonna anticipate this takes you around 10 minutes again. So at 1:10, I'll check in to see how everybody's doing. But I'm going to mute myself so that you can focus on taking the quiz. Case studies. So what we're going to do is I'm going to get the links and put them in the chat. We're going to do the same thing we did last time, only with 2 case studies instead of 1. So I'm going to give you 20 minutes. We'll see if that's enough time. Maybe I'll give you 25 just to be on the safe side in the breakout rooms. And then we will go from there. And when you get assigned to your breakout room, look at that number, because what you're going to do is you are actually going to do that part of the case study worksheet for both case studies. So both for Luke and for Beth. And I believe they're both in chapter 5. So everything is right there. They're shorter, so it shouldn't be really difficult, but I do want to give you plenty of time. So let me do this. All right, so here is the case study worksheet for Beth. And then here is the case study worksheet for Luke. So just like last time, your Zoom room number, your breakout room number will match the numbers that are on the actual Google form, Google Doc. I think the word ones are called docs. Sorry, the thing. And you will, again, fill that out for both case studies. So let me go ahead and get those breakout rooms set up. So we need 5. And it's going to randomize you. There'll be 3 to 4 people in a group. And then let me go ahead and set this for, I'll set it for 25. If everybody finishes sooner, just pop back into the main room. And we will go from there. And when we get back into the main room, we can also touch base briefly about like group assignments and things like that. So again, just to sort of get you all reoriented, 2 case studies. Your breakout room number will be the part of the case study you do. That those numbers are on the case study worksheet. And you'll do the same part for both case studies. All righty. So I am going to open all the rooms. And as usual, I will be available. If you have any questions, you can just use the little question mark in the room. Resume the recording, and then we will go over all of these together, just like we have. We'll do Luke first, go all the way through his case, and then we'll go all the way through Beth's case, just so we don't get back and forth. Like I did the other day, I will post this if you don't want to be scribbling stuff down, but if it helps you to physically write it out, also feel free to do that. But I'll post the links to these on Blackboard when we're done. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen. And before we get to our cases, I just want to brief you all about the groups and topics. You hopefully saw my email. These are based on some people requested to be in a group together, some people requested to be in a group together, but someone else was interested in the same topic. So then I put you in that group. And then the rest of them I just created based on people's expressed interests. So if I have inadvertently placed you with your, I don't know, ex-partner, your mortal enemy, things along that line, let me know. I can move you. You just have to send an email to me. It doesn't have to be a thing. But over the next few days, take a look and see if you do want to switch around. And then maybe an upcoming day, we'll go ahead and do these groups either as breakout rooms, or if I'm back on campus, then in person, so that y'all can exchange information and all that good stuff. Any questions about that bit? Cool. All right. Well, let's jump over to Luke's case. And let me go ahead and make this bigger so everybody can read it. And go ahead and have group one walk us through the identifying information and background. So this is Amanda, Macy, Sophia, and Will.
So for Luke, for the identifying information, he was a powerfully built Maori man, tattoos all over him, and he was admitted in the hospital at 28 years old. For background and history, he suffered from 3 minor head injuries from fights over the years and a minor motorcycle accident, but no history of a major head injury. He spent most of the time riding motorcycles, petty thieving, playing snooker, smoking weed, and consuming large amounts of alcohol.
Yeah, that's a really good detail. The only thing I have that's different is that he grew up in a large family in a poor area. Sometimes it's good to know about the person's socioeconomic status. And then I'll let you finish typing, Sophia, and I'll go into the next one. Thank you for doing that for me. And then the only other thing I have is that he left school at age 15. Things like that are important if you are going to be doing like an intelligence test, for example. And then that he had worked labor jobs, but also worked, relied on unemployment. And if you don't know what the term Maori is, it is the sort of Australian, New Zealand term for an Indigenous person. And they might choose to identify themselves that way. Awesome. Great job, group one. All right, so let's move on to group two and talk about what Luke's symptoms were. Let me get them all in one screen. There we go.
So for symptoms, he was unable to speak and he had weakness down the right side after waking up from his semi-comatose state. He had damage to the Broca's area of the brain, which is responsible for speech and motor movement. During the first week after his stroke, he was unable to speak more than single words, but he used a communication board and was able to, I put spell out in like quotes because they were ungrammatical and misspelled sentences, but they were like 3 to 4 words. He also had difficulty comprehending verbs in descriptive language. Like they gave an example of the pathologist would say the cat's under the chair, and then he would point to the picture with the cat on the chair. So he'd like difficulty comprehending descriptors. He also demonstrated he had apixia of the left arm and oral apixia, which means that he couldn't perform like purposeful movements with that arm. And he couldn't pretend to whistle or blow a kiss or sip from a straw. By the 10th day, he could speak in short sentences using function words like phone, mom, and with clues and suggestive words, he could form more complex descriptive sentences. The example in the case was he was talking about a jacket, and the doctor would say like leather, and he would be like, yeah, leather coat, black or something. The speech pathologist that he worked with found that if she sang a sentence, he could perform better when copying her.
Great, yeah, and I actually don't have anything to add, so very good job, very thorough. Yeah, that singing a sentence is actually a common way you work with people who have issues on the left side of the brain, because most of our brain is not as lateralized as the whole like left brain, right brain thing wants you to think it is. But the speech areas are focused on the left-hand side. But if you sing, it goes more through the right-hand side, so you can get to it a little more easily. Later in the semester, we'll watch a documentary about Representative Gabby Giffords, and this is one of the techniques that was used on her as she was recovering. Excellent. And I realized, I'm sorry, I didn't give credit where credit's due. That was Haley, and Michaela. And so now group 3 is Henry and Miranda.
So the CT results showed that Luke suffered a cerebrovascular accident, which is a brain hemorrhage in the Broca's area. He had difficulty comprehending sonatic function words. He performed well on the memory test that he was given, but he performed badly on the word fluency test. An assessment of his language functions was given 6 months post-hemorrhage, and they showed that his ability to speak spontaneously and with normal intonation was almost to a normal level. He was also given a full neuropsychological assessment, which showed that his nonverbal visuospatial abilities were average and his verbal abilities were low average. And then he declined a final follow-up assessment. And then also in the text, you referred that he didn't finish high school, and it said that he was a poor reader before his accident. So I just thought that was important.
Definitely. No, you're spot on, Miranda. That's so important. And that's why I pointed it out above in the background. Yeah, right. This is not a guy we would expect to be performing above average on these things, right? Just because of his level of education. And, a lot of these tests are contingent. We looked through some of the items on the waist, right? Some of those are contingent on stuff you may have learned later in high school, right? So it makes sense that, someone who didn't finish might not do as well. So that's very important. And it's a nice indicator of sort of premorbid function. Yeah, and I like that it talks about how he chose not to do the final testing, right? Because he, was just like, no, I'm good. I don't like where I am. And that is always someone's right. Even let's say if someone's getting like cancer treatment, they can choose not to do a screening. They can choose to stop chemo, right? That is completely within patients' rights. So, oh, and I didn't let y'all say diagnosis, but it looks like somehow it ended up with the next group anyway. So, but it's Broca's aphasia, which we'll talk a lot about. So this chapter, we're going to focus on the aphasias, and we'll talk a lot about, and we'll watch lots of videos about Broca's versus Wernicke's aphasias, and what the differences are. Yeah. All right. So next, group 4, we've got Brittany, Debbie, and Trayvon to talk about the impact on life and family.
So I recommend getting friends like Luke friends, because they were very supportive, and they even attended the treatments and rehabilitation sessions with him. There were some times when he escaped several times from rehab, but his friends They encouraged him through pretty much everything. They encouraged him to stop smoking. So they also stopped smoking. Luke himself stopped drinking except for like once a week. He was able to live with his friends, hold a job, and have a steady relationship. At first, he was angry and frustrated because others couldn't understand him, but his friends, again, being very supportive, were able to begin to understand him and his nonverbal cues. And they mentioned that he liked to play billiards with his friends.
Yeah, so like Trayvon said, super awesome, right? Like so great that he had such supportive friends, willing to understand his nonverbals, all quit smoking, so he'll quit smoking, things along those lines. Just fantastic, right? And then I mean the fact that he was able to drink once a week and hold it to that is great. There are different philosophies in treating addiction. So some people believe you need to be completely clean, completely abstinent from whatever drug or alcohol you were consuming, and others believe that something like this is just fine as long as it, you feel like you can control it. And it looks like in his case this worked. Alrighty, so now group 5, Hannah, Lola, and Reed, go ahead and tell us about the treatment and the effectiveness.
Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, I clicked a different button than I usually do. Okay, so yeah, he went to speech and physical therapy. He had individual and family psychological counseling. These were not, these were effective, sorry. His rehab, like we talked about before, was really contingent on the friends that he had and the support that he got from his family. They would try and make him laugh, and that was definitely effective in helping him recover. The billiards were also a key component for exercising his strength and coordination, which definitely helped regain most of his function. He had an assessment of language functions that we saw didn't really show any improvement because his levels weren't really that high beforehand. But at the end, he had the full neuropsychological assessment, and yeah, he was able to recover mostly.
Yeah, yep, spot on. And as you can see, sometimes these things overlap, and that's okay if groups broke down the same things. The only other thing that I have, and I'll just add it because it's short, was that he got a part-time job, which is really cool. And he was working in a nursery. So not a baby nursery, like a plant nursery. Right. So yeah, I mean, here you can see a guy who was able to basically get back to his life as normal. Again, with all the cases we look at, that doesn't always happen. But in cases like this, where they're really dedicated to rehab, the damage is something that we can rehab around, right? Entirely possible that you'll essentially return to what we call pre-morbid functioning. And as both of the last two groups pointed out, having that support is so important, right? This is so much harder to do on your own than it is when you have a really great support network like Luke did. So, awesome. All right, so let's go over to Beth. Once again, I'll make this big enough that everyone can hopefully see it, depending on what kind of device you're using right now. And we'll circle around back to group 1 to tell us about the identifying info and the background and history on Beth.
So for Beth, she was married at the age of 21. She was also very active in a rural community. And at the age of 62, at the time, like was the occurrence and like the diagnosis of her disorder. Her background and history: on her 62nd birthday, she went to bed early after saying she felt like very fatigued, and her husband noticed that her speech had just become very like stuttered and jumbled after dinner. The doctor diagnosed her with a stroke, and ambulance had to transport her to Auckland Hospital, I believe that's how you say it, where she got a CT scan and an anagram.
Excellent. Yeah. And then just the only things I would add, and again, these are short, so I can type them myself, is just more about her current, support system, husband, and she has 3 adult kids. And the other thing I thought it was pretty interesting that they talked about for her was that, because they were farmers, she was a large consumer of and rich dairy products, which didn't help some of her pre-morbid conditions like hypertension. And she was also, like Luke, a heavy smoker. Hopefully, if any of you do consume tobacco products, some of these make you think twice. Fortunately, it is very tied to things like vascular issues, which can include heart attack, stroke, what have you. So, great job to group 1. Now going on to group 2 to talk about the symptoms.
So she had language impairments and she had impairments with comprehending written and spoken language. And her spoken language was fluent sometimes, but her sentences were often nonsensical and you couldn't understand them. And they were just very random words. And in the past, she had been treated for hypertension and has a history of smoking, which are risk for factors of a stroke. She was unable to coordinate her hands because of a mild sensory loss in her right hand. She couldn't repeat words or sentences, and she had a difficulty to assess properly because of her poor ability to understand instructions given to her. And when speaking words, they would come out as paraphrases, and she could occasionally read single words out loud correctly, but that was about it, and it wasn't very often. Sometimes she would have difficulty assessing. Sometimes it would be difficult to assess her because of her speech being jumbled and her punctuation with a lot of her paraphrases. And after remaining in the hospital for about 3 weeks doing speech therapy daily, she had no improvements with her speech or comprehension of language. She could not feel light touch on her right arm due to the sensory issue. And she had spontaneous comments, which she would be answering a question. And during the question, she would interrupt herself and be like, well, what am I doing? And one of the hypotheses was that they came from the right hemisphere, which is thought to possess capacity to express exclamations and expletives.
Yeah, so maybe some of the same areas that get activated, say in Tourette's that we just watched the video about the other day. Yeah, the only other thing I had was an example of how these things worked for her. So she wrote her own name as S with 3 T's, right? So imagine you're in your 60s, you've been writing your own name, right, since you could write. That's usually one of the first things they teach you to write. And now you can't even write out your own name, right? Yeah, very, very difficult. Great job, good detail, group 2. All righty, so group 3, test results and diagnosis.
So for the diagnosis, Beth is kind of opposite of Luke. She has Wernicke's aphasia, and it's the inability to comprehend spoken or written language, but she's able to speak and have verbal expression fairly well, which is the opposite of Luke, who couldn't speak, but he could understand language.
Exactly, yeah. Yep, and then, with testing results, just they couldn't do them because of her lack of comprehension. I think about when we talked about the neuropsych assessments, how important standardization and the instructions are, right? And she can't understand that either listening or reading it, right? So you can't do it. So the only assessments they could do on her were a CT and an angiogram, which are just looking at the physical things. So yeah, very different than Luke, right? Where they were able to engage him in all these different assessments. I think part of what happened, and this will go into the next two groups, so I don't want to steal your thunder too much, but part of what happened, I think, for Luke versus Beth is not only the area of the brain, but also just resiliency, being 28 when it happened versus 62 can make a difference. All right, so group 4, tell us about the impact on life and family.
So Beth's case was a little sadder than Luke's. She was unable to communicate with the others in the nursing home, and she started to withdraw from groups and activities. She couldn't knit any longer and do the hobbies and things that she usually would love to do. She was unable to do them. And it was really stressful for her family to see her in the condition that she was in. They used to regularly visit, but because it was so stressful and disheartening, it was because she unknown how she felt with her family left, because she verbally couldn't express it, but they would assume she was sad because she would show emotions.
Yeah, this is really similar to how families feel with people with dementia, for example, that you might go to visit them and they don't recognize you, right? And this is like her husband, her children, so that can be really, really distressing for the family members as well. Yeah. So if you guys don't mind just like cleaning up your typos in there while we go on to the next group, that would be awesome. Okay, so group 5, tell us about how her treatment went and whether or not it was effective. Reed, if you're trying to talk, we can't hear you for some reason.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so I mean, she was, sorry, let me find it in the book too, just so I have two little things. Sorry about that. Give me just one little second. All right, there we go. So yeah, it was a little different from Luke's, obviously. She was hospitalized for 3 weeks. I mean, she had friends there. We didn't really put that, but she had friends there that was a little helpful. Then she did require nursing care. And then she was transferred to a private nursing home. That's where she spent the last few years of her life. I think a stroke is what fully ended it. And then it was like occupational therapy while she was like knitting. That wasn't really that effective though, because she couldn't really coordinate her hands because of the injury. And then she did partake in daily speech therapy. There was no improvement, however, in the speech comprehension. Sorry. And yeah, that's a lot of what we found during the private nursing home. It was she would socialize a bit more. She'd exercise her communication skills. They couldn't really understand her though. So, and then she did become more and more withdrawn the longer she was there.
Yeah, spot on. Again, her case is more depressing than Luke's, and again, that happens sometimes. I would say the only thing I would add is that she remained in the nursing home until her death 4 years later.
Yes, ma'am.
Which you talked about, but just wasn't on the form. So yeah, I mean, again, I know that for some of you, this is like super distressing to read these. And it is distressing, right? Like this happens to people. But yeah, it's important for us to cover those and not just like the good cases, right? Because this happens. And any of you are thinking of going into, honestly, clinical psychology in general, but particularly health psychology or neuropsychology, know that it can be a fairly difficult road. Here, I can stop sharing so y'all can like see each other's boxes instead of just the screen. So for example, when I was on my internship, my residency year, I was seeing a man who I believe had a heart attack and was in physical rehab for that. And so we'd go to the med rehab unit and just like check in with how they're doing, because we know that depression and anxiety can actually impede your ability to get better physically. So this guy was really depressed, expressed suicidal ideation. No one on that unit, because it wasn't a psychiatric unit, had ever experienced that before. It was like, from a trainee standpoint, my supervisor had left for the day. Luckily, one of my other supervisors was close by and helped me with like what the steps were we needed to go through with him. And so they got him to the point where he was fine. And then he was discharged, and I had to look him up like I think a month later to like make sure I'd completed some paperwork properly. And he had actually had another heart attack, and he had a DNR, which is a do not resuscitate. So he just passed, right? And they declared him dead when he came to the VA. So those things can stick with you, obviously, and it can make it difficult. But at the same time, you do have those other rewarding situations, right? So I think I've mentioned in here, like working with my clients who were on the spinal cord injury unit was generally really uplifting, because even though some of them literally couldn't do anything on their own, they were so optimistic and just like thankful to be alive. And the same thing with my blind rehab patients. Those were like some of my favorite conversations I had, because they would just sort of tell me about their lives, and if they were in distress, it was pretty easy to communicate with them about it. And again, you know, they weren't bitter about having lost their sight. I think a big part of that is because the VA's blind rehab is actually really good. So if any of you have ever been a federal employee or know anyone who is a federal employee and they brought home a pen, it'll often say something like made by blind veterans. Like that's part of their rehabilitation is they teach them to do different things like tooling leather and making things along those lines, and teach them how to navigate the world. And they, again, like in the blind rehab unit, they had a community of people. So obviously in Beth's situation, it was really tough because she couldn't communicate the way she wanted to, right? She couldn't comprehend what other people were saying. So it's hard to build that community. It's hard to make those connections. And then it's hard when your family wants to support you, right? But like, it's hard for them to come. It's hard for their mental health to see you like that and to have them not recognize you every time you go in there, right? Like just think about what that would be like to see your parent or your grandparent or another family member you're really close to and them just not recognizing you, right? It's really, and some of you may have had that experience again with relatives who've had dementia or things along those lines. So yeah, I know that again, it's not always happy shiny, obviously, but I think it's a really important part of this subfield to cover, right? Is that you will see people with head injuries who like make miraculous recoveries, and you will see people with something that maybe feels like shouldn't be that debilitating, and it is, right? I mean, like Beth and Luke's stories were not that dissimilar in terms of, you know, the brain trauma. It was just, you know, the area it happened to strike in made it much more difficult for Beth, right? And as I mentioned previously, Luke being younger, right, probably helped with the rehabilitation, although that's not always the case. Sorry, I'm just sort of chuckling because one of the sadder cases I saw on spinal cord injury was a young man who was only 18 who actually got his spinal cord injury during basic training. And he was actually like generally fine. He could actually walk with the assistance of a cane, I think, by the time I was working with him. But for him, it was like he was very demoralized by it, probably because he was only 18 and he was expected to be in the military and be very mobile, right? So he was probably the person on spinal cord injury I worked with the most, even though he was probably one of the people with the least loss of function, if that makes sense. So it can really be tied up in your identity as well. Alrighty. So on Tuesday, we will still be on Zoom because I have to wait till next Friday to get retested and make sure I'm negative, to make sure I didn't pick up COVID late from my family. So stick with me. We'll get through it, I promise. So on Tuesday, we'll be looking at some videos of what the aphasias look like, and we'll be talking about some of the dyslexias. A lot of people are surprised there are different types of dyslexia, for example. So we're going to talk about that. Alrighty, I'll stick around for a minute in case anyone has questions. If I don't see you, have a great weekend.